you. We'll start a round of 5-minute questions. Ambassador, you mentioned in your remarks some countries who were downgraded, including the Dominican Republic, to a Tier 2 watch list. Is that because of what is happening to laborers at the sugar mills that are taking place? I saw some reports of labor issues there.
Thank you for that question. The reason that the Dominican Republic was downgraded, the full details are in the narrative, but the highlight is that they are not appropriately screening their migrant workers, nor are they referring migrant workers to services, and they are not offering services to those who have been identified as trafficking. This was a case where we actually spoke about it in depth, and we are very concerned about this, systematic exclusion of providing services and even referring or screening the victims. And so that was the reason for their being downgraded.
I see. Because there's labor reports about the sugarcane refineries in the Dominican Republic using underage individuals and basically not providing certain fundamental labor rights to its citizens. I'd commend that to your attention as well. Cuba is once again a Tier 3 country in the annual Trafficking in Persons report. The Cuban regime actively employs forced labor practices through its foreign medical missions program. As the TIP report notes, by the end of 2021, Cuban medical missions were exported to close to 60 countries, where such workers were regularly threatened, denied salaries, forced to work under exploitive conditions, and had their travel documents seized. Obviously, the Cuban regime won't end this inhumane practice. What concrete actions has your office taken to elevate the voices of victims of the Cuban regime's human trafficking scheme and to develop a diplomatic campaign to end these forced labor practices once and for all?
Thank you for flagging this critical human rights abuse. I think the most important thing that the office is doing, number one, is in addition to calling out Cuba's horrible state-sponsored trafficking of their medical personnel in the Cuban narrative, we actually call out every country who is hosting and therefore providing money and supporting Cuba in that state-sponsored program. We listed this in 56 country narratives in the Trafficking in Persons report. And this, as you know, this TIP report is what drives our foreign diplomacy. So we are not only calling it out in the Cuban narrative, but also in the 56 country narratives that are by their using these medical personnel supporting that regime.
This is a set of circumstances where Cuban doctors and other medical personnel are sent to other countries. The country pays Cuba, not the medical professionals. They take the passports away of these medical professionals so that they can't leave, and they are in essence hostage. And it's the equivalent of slave labor from my perspective. And so these countries who are participating in this is equally as vile as the Cuban government's use of these individuals in a human trafficking case. Let me ask you this, Ambassador. The Government Accountability Office investigation in 2020 concluded that evaluating the effectiveness of anti-trafficking foreign assistance is difficult due to limited data, a focus on outputs versus over outcomes, and limited evaluation resources, among other factors. What steps are you and the department taking to sharpen our ability to successfully evaluate the effectiveness of our counter-trafficking assistance?
The effectiveness of our program is of paramount concern to both me and to the entire office. Ironically, I was a Trafficking in Persons Office grantee back when I was leading the Human Rights Department at an NGO. So I am super focused on making sure that we are using our money in the best way possible. We actually, the GAO reports that have come out recently have not only given us they have supported that what we're doing is unique and effective, but they absolutely have given us specific areas for improvement. And we agree with those areas for improvement, and we are making specific changes, including There was a recommendation to standardize our processes, and so we are doing that in our International Programs Department. We are increasing accountability by setting target indicators in each of our grants, and we are establishing, which I think is really important to make sure that we are using the money in the most efficient way possible, we're establishing sustainability plans for each of our grants so that when the money pulls out, we know that our good work will continue to remain in force.
And finally, Mr. Walsh, speaking about effectiveness of anti-trafficking programming, we know that human trafficking has evolved since the TVPA was first passed in 2000, and that our efforts at addressing human trafficking have had some modest success worldwide. I heard your testimony. In my own personal perspective, I think there's much more USAID could be doing. What type of anti-trafficking programming or advocacy has been most effective? And what types of our foreign assistance have fallen short and can be improved?
Thank you for the question. I think that the problem varies so much from region to region that our instances of most effective programming are often very different from each other and tailored to local circumstances. But as examples of where I think we've been very effective, I would cite, for example, in Southeast Asia, we have a number of programs in different countries to target trafficking in the fisheries industry. And because it's offshore, because it's often taking advantage of migrant labor, these are populations that are very prone to being exploited. And so I think we have used the full range of our toolkit, including very modern technological solutions that are still very useful to a vulnerable population. So for example, reporting mechanisms such that someone who is being held against their will on a ship in some facility adjacent to the fisheries industry has a lot more ability to access authorities than they maybe had in 2001 when this all started, and that's us trying to be flexible. We pair that with a host of civil society organizations that are advocating with the governments of Southeast Asia to apply pressure, to tighten safeguards, to work with law enforcement, to watch for this, and with support to victims, to survivors after we've found them. Now that applies to lots of industries. I single out the fisheries one as one where we've found especially exploitative circumstances that has grown in recent years. But by the same token, I think we have tried to help on the migration crisis in the Western Hemisphere by working in both source and transit countries in a variety of ways. So for example, in Guatemala, one effort that we think has been especially useful is called, you'll forgive me, I'm not a Spanish speaker, but El Refugio de la Niñez. And it's a shelter providing a full range of services to trafficking survivors aimed at providing immediate emergency care, psychosocial help, mental support, often physical, medical support, but also helping them to reintegrate into their own communities. Sometimes they are from Guatemala, and sometimes they started somewhere else. But having a shelter like that and a network of very professionalized support can help reduce the likelihood, for those who were migrants, who were exploited on the way, can help reduce the likelihood of remigration, can help target those root causes that send people onward in the first place. And it's been embraced by a lot of the civil society community there. So I could give, there are other examples, like Ukraine is a completely different context, obviously, but I think the fact that we were doing years and years of trafficking work, counter-trafficking work in Ukraine before Putin's further invasion last year gave us this huge base to build upon, such that when just the calamity of especially early February 22 hit, there was already in place a national hotline with 6,000 people responding to reports of trafficking, and as the problem radically changed, there were tools in place to support that. I think that's true across a lot of Ukraine efforts, but it's especially true here. So in each of those cases, those are missions targeting local circumstances on their own. We have a fairly decentralized model, but I think that's where it's effective because the problem is so different in those places.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to have my staff follow up with you on
course.
a few ideas that we have and some perspectives. Senator Risch.